Margaret Ellis thought she was capturing a simple graduation photo that spring morning in 1910. The beloved Savannah schoolteacher arranged her students in their Sunday best, watching them beam with pride as the photographer prepared his camera. But when the developed photograph arrived weeks later, Margaret discovered something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Standing in the back row was a tall, severe-looking woman who had never set foot in her classroom. A woman whose face appeared to be crudely stitched together like a patchwork quilt. Most disturbing of all, when Margaret tried to show others the photograph, the mysterious figure had vanished completely, as if she refused to be captured twice. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The morning of May 15, 1810, dawned crisp and clear in Savannah, Georgia, with the kind of golden sunlight that photographers prayed for. Margaret Ellis stood in the doorway of Whitmore Elementary School, smoothing her dark wool skirt and adjusting the cameo brooch at her throat as she watched her graduating class of 22 students file into the Browlin courtyard. At 34, Margaret had dedicated 12 years of her life to teaching the children of Savannah's working families, and this particular group held a special place in her heart. They had weathered the harsh winter together, struggled through arithmetic lessons and penmanship exercises, and now they were ready to move on to their next chapter. The photographer, a thin man named Harold Blackwood, who traveled from Atlanta with his heavy equipment, was already setting up his tripod and adjusting his camera when Margaret stepped outside. The children chattered excitedly among themselves, their voices carrying the musical cadence of the Deep South. Little Rebecca Chen, daughter of the town's only Chinese laundry owner, tugged nervously at her white lace collar, while James Kowalski, whose Polish immigrant parents worked at the cotton mill, tried to slick down his unruly hair with spit and determination. "Children, children," Margaret called out, her voice carrying the authority that came from years of managing boisterous classrooms. "Please arrange yourselves as we practiced yesterday. Shorter ones in front, taller ones in the back." She moved among them like a conductor orchestrating a symphony, gently guiding Sarah McKinnon to the front row and nudging Robert Fitzgerald toward the back, where his gangly frame wouldn't block the smaller children. As the students settled into their positions, Margaret couldn't help but feel a surge of maternal pride. These weren't just her pupils, they were her legacy. In a world where education was often considered a luxury for the wealthy, she had fought tooth and nail to ensure that every child in her classroom, regardless of their family's station, received the same quality instruction. The mill owner's children sat beside the sons and daughters of servants, all united by their shared hunger for knowledge and Margaret's unwavering belief in their potential. Harold Blackwood peered through his camera lens and frowned. "Miss Ellis, I'm afraid we need someone taller in the back row to balance the composition. Do you have another student who could join us?" He gestured toward the back, where a gap in the arrangement created an awkward visual hole in what should have been a perfect triangular formation. Margaret glanced around the courtyard, but all of her students were already in position. "I'm sorry, Mr. Blackwood, but this is everyone. Perhaps I could stand in the back myself?" She had been planning to remain off to the side, preferring to let the children have their moment in the spotlight. But if it would improve the photograph, she was willing to join them. "That would be perfect," Harold replied, adjusting his lens. "Just step right there behind young Robert." He pointed to the spot where Margaret should position herself, seemingly unaware that his suggestion would place her directly next to someone who wasn't there. Margaret moved to the back row, her hand resting gently on Robert's shoulder as she found her place. The morning sun felt warm on her face, and she could smell the sweet fragrance of magnolia blossoms from the tree that overhung the school's front gate. Everything felt perfect, exactly as a graduation photo should feel, captured in that eternal moment between childhood and the responsibilities that awaited beyond the classroom walls. "Everyone hold very still," Harold called out as he disappeared beneath the black cloth draped over his camera. "This will take several seconds, so no moving, no blinking, and certainly no giggling." His muffled voice carried a gentle humor that put the children at ease, though Margaret noticed young Timothy Walsh's cheeks were already twitching with suppressed laughter. The shutter clicked, capturing what should have been a simple moment in time. 22 children in their finest clothes, their teacher standing proudly behind them. the solid brick facade of Whitmore Elementary providing a dignified backdrop. It was the kind of photograph that would hang in parlors and be tucked into family Bibles. A treasured reminder of education's promise and childhood's fleeting nature. But as Harold packed up his equipment and promised to have the developed photographs ready within 2 weeks, none of them could have imagined what the camera had truly captured. Margaret dismissed the children with hugs and well wishes, watching as they scattered to their homes and summer adventures. She lingered in the courtyard long after the last student had disappeared around the corner, already missing their daily presence and wondering what the next school year would bring. The days that followed were filled with the administrative tasks that marked the end of every school year. Margaret organized her classroom, supplies, updated student records, and prepared reports for the school board. She found herself frequently glancing toward the spot where Harold had set up his camera, replaying the morning in her mind and anticipating the arrival of their graduation photograph. It had been such a perfect day, with every detail falling into place as if orchestrated by some benevolent force. When Harold Blackwood returned to Whitmore Elementary on the morning of May 30th, he carried with him a manila envelope containing 23 copies of the graduation photograph. Margaret had ordered extras so that each child could have their own copy to take home to their families. A gesture that had required her to dip into her own modest savings, the one she considered worthwhile. These children deserved to have this milestone documented and preserved. Harold seemed unusually quiet as he handed over the envelope, his usual jovial demeanor replaced by something Margaret couldn't quite identify. "Miss Ellis," he said, adjusting his spectacles nervously, "I want you to know that I double-checked my equipment and my developing process. Everything was done exactly as it should have been." He paused, as if weighing whether to say more, then shook his head and tipped his hat. "Good day to you, ma'am. I hope the photographs meet with your approval." Margaret watched him drive away in his modest carriage, puzzled by his strange behavior but eager to see the results of their graduation session. She waited until she was alone in her classroom before carefully opening the envelope and sliding out the photographs. The image that greeted her was both exactly what she expected and completely wrong in ways that made her heart skip irregularly. There were her 22 students, exactly as they had posed that morning. Rebecca Chen in the front row with her perfectly pressed white dress, James Kowalski attempting to look serious despite the cowlick that refused to stay down. Saram Sakinen's gap-toothed smile bright with joy. Every child was captured perfectly, their faces glowing with the pride of accomplishment and the anticipation of summer freedom. And there was Margaret herself, standing in the back row with her hand on Robert's shoulder, her own smile gentle and maternal. But standing directly beside her, where there had been empty space during the actual photograph session, was a tall woman in a dark dress that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The woman's face was the most disturbing element of all, appearing to be constructed from mismatched pieces, like a macabre puzzle assembled by unsteady hands. Margaret's breath caught in her throat as she studied the stranger's features more closely. The woman's left eye was smaller than her right, positioned slightly too high on what might have been a borrowed cheekbone. Her nose appeared to have been taken from a different face entirely, its shape and size completely wrong for the structure surrounding it. Most unsettling of all was her mouth, which seemed to have been stitched into place, with visible seam lines extending from the corners like some grotesque approximation of a smile. The woman's hair hung in lank strands around her face, and her clothing, while period-appropriate, had an oddly timeless quality that made it impossible to place her social standing or occupation. She stood perfectly still among the group, her presence so naturalistic that anyone glancing casually at the photograph might assume she belonged there. But Margaret knew with absolute certainty that no such person had been present during the photography session. Margaret set the photograph aside with trembling hands and examined the remaining copies, hoping that what she had seen was some kind of development error that might be limited to a single print. But every copy showed the same impossible image, the mysterious woman standing in the back row as if she had every right to be there. Margaret spread several photographs across her desk, comparing them carefully. But the woman's position and appearance remained consistent in each one. The logical part of Margaret's mind searched for rational explanations, Perhaps someone had been standing behind the camera, and Harold's equipment had somehow created a double exposure. Maybe there had been another teacher present that Margaret had simply forgotten about in the excitement of the moment. But even as she grasped for these came possibilities. She knew they didn't hold up to scrutiny. Margaret's memory of that morning was crystal clear, and she would have noticed another adult joining their group, especially one with such distinctive and unsettling features. That afternoon, Margaret walked to Harold Blackwood's temporary studio in a rented room above Peterson's general store. She found him packing his equipment for the journey back to Atlanta, his movements quick and efficient, as if he were eager to leave Savannah behind. When she knocked on his door, he opened it only part way, his eyes darting nervously around the hallway, before stepping aside to let her enter. "Miss Ellis, I was hoping you might come by," Harold said, gesturing for her to sit in the room's single chair while he perched on the edge of a wooden crate. "I've been thinking about your photograph all morning, and I want you to know that I've been taking pictures for 15 years. I've developed thousands of plates, and I've never seen anything like what appeared in your image." Margaret reached into her bag and withdrew one of the graduation photographs, placing it on the small table between them. "Mr. Blackwood, can you explain how this woman came to be in our photograph? I can assure you that she was not present during the session, and I cannot find any record of her in our school files or anywhere else in Quaint." "Savannah." Harold leaned forward to study the photograph, his face growing pale as he examined the mysterious figure. "Miss Ellis, I've examined my equipment thoroughly, and there's no mechanical explanation for what you see here. The woman appears to have been photographed at the same time as everyone else, under the same lighting conditions, with the same focus and depth. She's not a double exposure or a development accident. According to every technical aspect of this image, she was standing right there beside you when I took this picture." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine despite the warm afternoon air filtering through the room's single window. "But that's impossible, Mr. Blackwood. I remember every moment of that session. There was no one else present except my students and myself." Harold rubbed his temples as if fighting off a headache. "Miss Ellis, there's something else I need to tell you, something that's been bothering me since I developed these plates. When I first pulled this image from the chemical bath, the woman's face looked different, more normal. It was during the fixing process that her features began to change, as if the chemicals were revealing something that had been hidden beneath the surface." Margaret's hands clenched in her lap. "What do you mean, exactly?" "I watched it happen," Harold said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "It was like watching someone remove a mask, except in reverse. Her face became more patchwork, more stitched together, as if the photographic process was revealing her true nature instead of concealing it. I've never seen anything like it, and I pray I never will again." Margaret left Harold's studio with more questions than answers, the graduation photograph tucked safely in her bag, but weighing on her mind like a physical burden. She spent the rest of the afternoon walking through Savannah's familiar streets, trying to make sense of what she had witnessed. The rational part of her mind insisted that there had to be a logical explanation, but a growing sense of unease suggested that logic might not be sufficient to explain this particular mystery. That evening, Margaret sat in her small parlor with the photograph spread on her coffee table, a magnifying glass borrowed from her neighbor, allowing her to examine every detail of the mysterious woman's appearance. Under magnification, the stitched quality of the woman's features became even more pronounced, as if she had been assembled from different people entirely. Margaret could see faint lines where the pieces of her face connected, like scars that had healed poorly, or seams that had been inexpertly joined. The woman's clothing, too, revealed strange details under close examination. While it appeared to be a typical 1910 dress from a distance, the magnifying glass revealed inconsistencies in the fabric's weave and pattern, as if different pieces from different garments had been combined to create her dasquine outfit. Even her hair seemed to shift between textures and colors, dark in some areas and lighter in others, as if it couldn't decide what it wanted to be. Margaret was so absorbed in her examination that she didn't notice the sun setting outside her windows until her parlor was cast in shadows. She lit the oil lamp beside her chair and returned to the photograph, but something had changed. The mysterious woman, who had been standing clearly visible in the back row just moments before, was no longer there. Margaret blinked hard and held the photograph closer to the light. But the back row now showed only Margaret herself standing behind her students, exactly as it should have been. Heart pounding, Margaret grabbed the other copies of the photograph from the envelope, spreading them across her table in the lamplight. Every single copy now showed the same thing. The graduation group exactly as it had been arranged that morning, with no mysterious woman anywhere to be seen. Margaret checked and rechecked each photograph, but the patchwork-faced stranger had vanished completely, leaving no trace of her ever having been there. Margaret spent a sleepless night wondering if she had imagined the entire experience, but Harold Blackwood's words echoed in her memory, confirming that she had not been the only witness to the woman's presence. The next morning, she returned to his studio, only to find that he had departed for Atlanta earlier than planned, leaving no forwarding address with the proprietor of the general store. The mystery might have ended there, filed away as one of those inexplicable experiences that occasionally intrude upon ordinary life, if not for what happened when Margaret began distributing the photographs to her former students. She visited each family personally, presenting the children with their graduation portraits, and receiving the grateful thanks of parents who treasured these formal documents of their children's educational achievements. It was at the Chen family's laundry that Margaret first noticed something was wrong. Mrs. Chen, a quiet woman who spoke limited English, but whose intelligence was evident in her carefully managed business, accepted the photograph with a deep bow of gratitude. But as she examined the image, her expression changed to one of confusion and fear. "Miss Ellis," Mrs. Chen said in her careful English. "Who is this woman in the back? She was not there when picture was taken." She pointed to the back row, and Margaret's blood ran cold. The mysterious woman was there again, standing exactly where she had appeared in Margaret's first viewing of the photograph, her patchwork face clearly visible among the group. Margaret took the photograph from Mrs. Chen's hands, studying it carefully. The woman was indeed there, as solid and present as any of the students, her stitched features exactly as Margaret remembered them. "Mrs. Chen, you're absolutely right. She was not present when the photograph was taken. I don't know who she is or how she came to appear in this image." Mrs. Chen stepped back from the photograph as if it might contaminate her by proximity. "In China, we have stories of hungry ghosts, spirits who cannot rest. They attach themselves to happy moments, trying to steal joy for themselves. This woman, she has the look of someone who is not finished with living." Why? Margaret left the Chen family's laundry with a growing sense of dread, but she continued her rounds, determined to deliver photographs to all of her students' families. At each stop, the mysterious woman appeared and disappeared, seemingly at random. Sometimes she was visible in the photograph when Margaret arrived. Sometimes she appeared only after the family had examined the image for several minutes, and sometimes she remained invisible throughout the entire visit. The Kowalski family, Polish immigrants who had brought their own stories of supernatural encounters from the old country, took one look at the photograph and immediately began discussing protection rituals in their native language. James's father, a practical man who worked long hours at the cotton mill, crossed himself when he saw the woman and insisted that Margaret take the photograph back. "Miss Ellis," he said in accented but clear English. "In Poland, we know of such things. This woman, she is not natural. She feeds on innocence, on the joy of children. You must not let her remain attached to these pictures." He handed the photograph back to Margaret with shaking hands. "Please, take it away from my family." Margaret found herself in the strange position of carrying photographs that seemed to have a will of their own, revealing their hidden occupant to some viewers, while remaining perfectly normal for others. The children themselves seemed to have mixed reactions to the mysterious woman's presence. Some saw her clearly and asked innocent questions about who she was, while others looked directly at her location in the photograph and saw nothing unusual. It was young Timothy Walsh, the boy who had struggled with giggles during the photography session, who provided the most chilling observation. When his mother showed him the graduation photograph, Timothy studied it carefully before looking up with wide, serious eyes. "Mama," he said in the matter-of-fact way that children have of stating uncomfortable truths, "that lady in the back wasn't there when we took the picture, but she's been watching us for a long time. I used to see her standing outside our classroom window during arithmetic lessons, but when I told Miss Ellis, couldn't see her at all. Timothy's mother, Sarah Walsh, worked as a seamstress and had developed sharp eyes for detail through years of careful needlework. She examined the photograph closely, paying particular attention to the mysterious woman's appearance. "Miss Ellis, this woman's face, it's not natural. Look at how her features don't quite fit together, as if someone has sewn different pieces together to make a whole person." Margaret had noticed the same thing during her magnified examination of the photograph, but hearing it confirmed by someone else made the observation feel more real and more disturbing. "Mrs. Walsh, have you ever seen or heard of anyone matching this woman's description in Savannah?" Sarah Walsh shook her head slowly. "No, Miss Ellis. And I would remember someone who looked like this. But there's something about her that reminds me of the old stories my grandmother used to tell about women who died in childbirth, or lost children to illness. Sometimes their grief was so strong that it wouldn't let them rest properly. They would attach themselves to other people's children, trying to fill the emptiness inside them." Over the following weeks, Margaret found herself drawn into research that took her far from the comfortable world of lesson plans and grade books. She spent hours in Savannah's public library, searching through local newspapers and historical records for any mention of a woman who might match the mysterious figure in her photograph. She consulted with the city's oldest residents, hoping that someone might remember a tragedy or disappearance that could explain the woman's appearance. The librarian, Mrs. Adelaide Hoffman, was particularly helpful in Margaret's research. Adelaide had worked at the library for 20 years and had developed an encyclopedic knowledge of Savannah's history and its more unusual stories. When Margaret described the woman in the photograph, Adelaide's expression grew thoughtful. "Miss Ellis, there are several stories that might be relevant to what you've experienced, but none of them have happy endings." Adelaide led Margaret to a section of the library that housed the city's historical archives, pulling several bound volumes from the shelves. These are accounts of unusual events that were documented by various residents and officials over the past 50 years. Some of them might sound like folklore, but they were reported as factual occurrences by reliable witnesses. Margaret spent hours reading through the archives, discovering a pattern of strange encounters that stretched back decades. There were reports of a tall woman in dark clothing who appeared at family gatherings and community celebrations, always standing at the edges of group photographs or lurking in the background of important events. The descriptions varied in their details, but they all shared common elements: a patchwork quality to the woman's appearance, her tendency to appear in photographs where she hadn't been physically present, and her particular interest in children and educational settings. One account, written by a school principal in 1895, described a situation remarkably similar to Margaret's experience. Principal Jonathan Hartwell had organized a photograph of his entire student body to commemorate the school's 10th anniversary. When the photograph was developed, it showed a strange woman standing among the children, her face appearing to be assembled from mismatched pieces, and her presence unexplained by anyone who had been present during the session B. According to Hartwell's account, the woman appeared and disappeared from the photograph, seemingly at random, visible to some viewers but not to others. Several families reported that their children began experiencing nightmares after receiving their copies of the photograph, dreams in which the strange woman visited their bedrooms and spoke to them in a voice that sounded like multiple people talking at once. Margaret found another account from 1902, written by a photographer named Marcus Webb, who had been hired to take portraits at a wealthy family's estate. Webb recorded that when he developed the photographs from the event, several of them contained the image of a woman who had not been present during the photography session. According to Webb's notes, the woman's face appeared to be constructed rather than born, with features that seemed to belong to different people entirely. What made Webb's account particularly unsettling was his description of what happened when he attempted to show the photographs to others. Like Margaret's experience, the woman appeared and disappeared from the images seemingly at will, visible to some viewers while remaining completely absent to others. Webb eventually destroyed all of the photographs from that session, reporting that he felt the woman's presence was somehow harmful to those who viewed her image. The most disturbing account Margaret found was written in 1906 by Dr. Helena Morrison, a physician who had been documenting unusual medical cases in the Savannah area. Dr. Morrison wrote about treating several children who had been exposed to photographs containing the mysterious woman's image. The children all reported similar symptoms, including nightmares, a sense of being watched, and the feeling that someone was trying to communicate with them through their dreams. According to Dr. Morrison's notes, the children described dreams in which the patchwork woman visited them and spoke about her need to find her own children, who had been taken from her long ago. The woman in their dreams claimed that she had been searching for decades, attaching herself to photographs of other people's children in hopes of finding the ones she had lost. Dr. Morrison theorized that the woman's grief had somehow transcended death, creating a spiritual presence that was drawn to innocence and youth. Margaret closed the last of the archive volumes with shaking hands, her mind reeling from what she had discovered. The pattern was clear. The mysterious woman had been appearing in photographs throughout Savannah for at least 15 years, always in connection with children and educational settings. But what troubled Margaret most was the suggestion in Dr. Morrison's account that the woman's presence might be harmful to the children who were exposed to her image. That evening, Margaret sat in her parlor with all 23 copies of the graduation photograph spread across every available surface. She had been checking them periodically throughout her research, and the pattern of the woman's appearances and disappearances seemed to be accelerating. Sometimes she was visible in all of the copies simultaneously, sometimes in only a few, and sometimes she vanished completely for hours at a time. Margaret had begun to feel as if she were engaged in some kind of supernatural game of hide-and-seek, with the mysterious woman revealing herself only when it suited her purposes. The woman's expression never changed in the photographs, maintaining the same stitched-together approximation of a smile, but Margaret had begun to sense a growing urgency in her presence, as if time were running out for some unknown purpose. As Margaret studied the photographs in the lamplight, she noticed something new. The woman's position in the back row had shifted slightly, moving closer to Margaret herself in each appearance. In the earliest viewings, the woman had stood at the far end of the back row, but now she appeared to be leaning toward Margaret as if trying to whisper something in her ear. The change was subtle but unmistakable, suggesting that the woman's presence in the photograph was not static but actively evolving. Margaret had just made this observation when she heard a soft knocking at her front door. She glanced at the clock on her mantel, surprised to see that it was nearly 10 o'clock in the evening, far too late for a social call. The knocking came again, gentle but persistent, and Margaret reluctantly set aside the photographs to answer the door. Standing on her front porch was Rebecca Chen, still wearing the white dress from the graduation photograph, but now looking pale and frightened. The little girl's parents would never have allowed her to be out alone at this hour, and Margaret immediately invited her inside while trying to understand how she had come to be there. "Rebecca, sweetheart, what are you doing out so late? Do your parents know where you are?" Margaret led the child into her parlor, noting that Rebecca's eyes were drawn immediately to the photographs scattered around the room. Rebecca moved toward the photographs as if pulled by an invisible string, her small hands reaching out to touch one of the copies. "Miss Ellis, the lady in the picture has been visiting my dreams. She says she knows where my real parents are, the ones who gave me away when I was a baby. She wants to take me to see them, but she needs me to help her first." Margaret felt her blood turn to ice as she gently took Rebecca's hands and led her away from the photographs. "Rebecca, what exactly did this lady tell you in your dreams?" The child's voice was dreamy and distant, as if she were still partially asleep. "She told me that she lost her own children a long time ago, and she's been searching for them ever since. She said that if I help her find them, she'll take me to my real family, the one that looks like me and will love me the way I deserve to be loved." Margaret knelt down to Rebecca's eye level, taking the child's hands in her own. "Rebecca, I need you to listen to me very carefully. The lady in the photograph is not someone who can help you. She's not real in the way that you and I are real, and the things she's telling you in your dreams are not true. Your parents, Mr. and Mrs. Chen, they love you very much, and they are your real family." Rebecca's expression grew confused, as if she were trying to reconcile two different versions of reality. "But Miss Ellis, she showed me pictures in my dreams of a beautiful Chinese woman who looked just like me. She said that my real mother has been crying every day since I was taken away from her, and that she's been waiting for me to come home." Margaret realized that the mysterious woman was exploiting Rebecca's natural questions about her adoption, using the child's longing for connection to manipulate her emotions. The Chen family had always been open with Rebecca about her adoption, but like many adopted children, she sometimes wondered about her biological parents and whether they might provide something that her adoptive family could not. Rebecca, the lady in the photograph, feeds on sad feelings and confusion. She takes children's natural questions and uses them to make children feel unhappy with the families who love them. Margaret chose her words carefully, trying to explain a complex supernatural situation in terms that a young child could understand. She doesn't really know anything about your birth parents, and she can't take you to them because that's not how adoption works. Margaret walked Rebecca home, through Savannah's quiet streets, staying with the family long enough to explain the situation to Mr. and Mrs. Chen. The parents were grateful for Margaret's intervention, but deeply concerned about their daughter's exposure to what they now recognized as a malevolent spiritual presence. Mrs. Chen immediately began preparing traditional protective charms, while Mr. Chen spoke of consulting with the Chinese community's eldest members for advice on dealing with vengeful spirits. The next morning brought more troubling news. Margaret arrived at school to find several parents waiting for her, all carrying copies of the graduation photograph, and all reporting similar experiences with their children. The mysterious woman had been appearing in dreams throughout the night, targeting the children with promises and manipulations tailored to each child's particular vulnerabilities. James Kowalski's parents reported that their son had dreamed of the woman promising to reunite him with, quote, grandparents who had died in Poland before his birth. Sarah Masichinen's mother described nightmares in which the woman claimed that Sarah's deceased father was waiting for her in a special place, where families never had to be separated. In each case, the woman was exploiting the children's natural griefs and longings, using their emotional vulnerabilities to establish psychological connections. Margaret realized that the situation had moved beyond her ability to handle alone. She needed help, but the rational authorities she might normally turn to, school administrators, local officials, even clergy, would likely dismiss her claims as hysteria or imagination. She needed someone who understood the supernatural aspects of what was happening and could provide practical guidance for protecting the children. Mrs. Adelaide Hoffman, at the BIA Library, had mentioned during Margaret's research that Savannah was home to several individuals who specialized in unusual spiritual matters. One name in particular had come up repeatedly in the historical accounts Margaret had studied: Mama Lavinia, an elderly woman who lived in the city's historic district and was known for her ability to deal with restless spirits and supernatural disturbances. Margaret had never sought out such services before, her Presbyterian upbringing having instilled in her a healthy skepticism toward folk magic and spiritual practices. But the safety of her students outweighed her personal reservations, and she found herself walking toward Mama Lavinia's house on the afternoon of June 2nd, carrying one of the graduation photographs in a manila envelope. Mama Lavinia's house was a modest wooden structure, painted in soft blue, with wind chimes hanging from the porch eaves and protective symbols carved into the window frames. The elderly woman who answered Margaret's knock was small and dignified, with silver hair braided down her back, and eyes that seemed to see more than they should. She invited Margaret inside without being told why she had come, as if the visit had been expected. "You've got yourself a picture problem, don't you, child?" Mama Lavinia said as she led Margaret into a sitting room filled with candles, dried herbs, and religious artifacts from various traditions. "I've been feeling her stirring around the city for weeks now, getting stronger and more desperate. She's been quiet for a few years, but something's awakened her again." Margaret removed the graduation photograph from its envelope and placed it on the small table between them. Mama Lavinia studied the image carefully, her expression growing grave as she examined the mysterious woman in the back row. "Lord have mercy," Mama Lavinia whispered, touching her fingers to a small cross hanging around her neck. "She's clearer than I've ever seen her before. Usually she's just a shadow, a suggestion of presence, but in this picture, she's almost solid. That's not good news, child. Not good news at all." Margaret leaned forward anxiously. "Mama Lavinia, who is she? What does she want with my students?" The elderly woman continued to study the photograph. occasionally making small clicking sounds with her tongue as she noticed particular details. Her name was Constance Whitmore, and she lived here in Savannah about 5 years ago. She was a teacher, like you, worked at the very school where you took this picture. She loved those children like they were her own, maybe loved them too much for her own good. Mama Lavinia moved to a wooden cabinet and withdrew a leather-bound journal, flipping through pages covered in careful handwriting until she found the entry she was looking for. Constance never married, never had children of her own. She poured all of her maternal feelings into her students, and when the yellow fever outbreak came in 1885, she lost most of them in a single month. 23 children dead, including some who had been like daughters and sons to her. Margaret felt her heart sink as she began to understand the scope of the tragedy. What happened to Constance after the outbreak? The grief broke her mind. Mama Lavinia continued, still reading from her journal. She became convinced that the children weren't really dead, that they had just been taken somewhere she couldn't find them. She started collecting photographs of other people's children, trying to piece together a new family from images and memories. People said she would sit in her empty classroom for hours, talking to the ghosts of her students and planning lessons for children who would never return. Mama Lavinia closed the journal and looked directly at Margaret. Constance died in 1887, alone in that same classroom where she had taught. They found her surrounded by photographs of children, hundreds of them collected from families all over the city. But her death didn't end her searching. Her spirit has been appearing in photographs ever since, still looking for her lost students, still trying to build the family that was taken from her. Margaret absorbed this information, understanding now why the mysterious woman had appeared in her graduation photograph and why she was targeting the children with manipulative dreams. Mama Lavinia, how can I protect my students? Several of them have already been contacted through their dreams, and I'm afraid the situation is getting worse. The elderly woman stood up and began gathering various items from around the room. Candles, small cloth bags filled with herbs, and several pieces of jewelry that looked handmade. The first thing you need to understand is that Constance isn't evil in the traditional sense. She's a grieving mother figure whose love has become twisted by loss and time. But that doesn't make her any less dangerous to living children. Mama Lavinia handed Margaret a small cloth bag tied with red thread. This is for protection. Keep it with you whenever you're handling those photographs. Constance feeds on emotional connections, especially the bonds between teachers and students. She sees you as a rival, another woman who has the children she believes should be hers. Margaret accepted the protective charm, feeling slightly foolish, but also grateful for any potential help. What should I tell the parents? How can I explain this situation without sounding like I've lost my mind? You don't need to explain the supernatural aspects, Mama Lavinia said, as she prepared additional protective items for Margaret to distribute. Just tell them that their children have been exposed to disturbing images that are causing nightmares, and that these items will help their children sleep peacefully. Most parents are more concerned with practical solutions than explanations. Mama Lavinia walked Margaret through a ritual designed to sever the connection between the mysterious woman and the graduation photographs. The process involved burning specific herbs while reciting prayers from multiple religious traditions, creating a spiritual barrier that would prevent Constance from using the images as doorways into the children's dreams. Margaret followed the instructions carefully, hoping that her lack of experience with such matters wouldn't diminish the ritual's effectiveness. As smoke from the burning herbs filled the small room, Margaret watched in fascination and horror as the graduation photograph began to change before her eyes. The image of Constance Whitmore grew fainter and more transparent, as if the ritual were slowly erasing her presence from the captured moment. But rather than disappearing completely, the ghostly teacher seemed to be fighting against the spiritual barriers being erected around her. She's stronger than I expected, Mama Lavinia murmured, adding more herbs to the burning bowl. 25 years of grief and searching have given her considerable power. This may require more than one attempt. The elderly woman's voice carried a note of concern that made Margaret's stomach clench with worry. Margaret spent the next several hours at Mama Lavinia's house, learning techniques for spiritual protection and understanding the full scope of what she was dealing with. According to Mama Lavinia's extensive research into Savannah's supernatural history, Constance Whitmore's spirit had been growing stronger over the years, fed by her encounters with living children and her increasing desperation to rebuild the family she had lost. The yellow fever outbreak that took her students was particularly cruel. Mama Lavinia explained as she prepared protective charms for each of Margaret's former students. Those children didn't just die, they suffered for weeks while Constance watched helplessly. She held their hands as they passed, promised them that she would always keep them safe, and when they died anyway, her mind couldn't accept that she had failed them. Margaret learned that Constance's appearances in photographs had been escalating over the years, becoming more frequent and more aggressive in her attempts to contact living children. The spirit had developed increasingly sophisticated methods of manipulation, tailoring her approach to each child's specific emotional needs and vulnerabilities. Rebecca Chen's adoption issues, James Kowalski's separation from extended family, Sarah McKinnon's grief over her father's death, all of these represented opportunities for Constance to establish psychological connections. She studies them, Mama Lavinia said as she tied protective herbs into small sachets, watches them from the edges of their vision, learns their fears and desires, then uses that knowledge to present herself as someone who can provide what they're missing. It's a sophisticated form of spiritual predation. As the afternoon wore on, Margaret gained a deeper understanding of the supernatural forces she was confronting. Constance Whitmore wasn't simply a confused ghost wandering aimlessly through the world of the living. She was an intelligent, determined spirit with a specific mission and the accumulated power of decades spent pursuing that goal. Margaret's graduation photograph had provided her with access to 22 new potential victims, children whose innocence and vulnerability made them perfect targets for her manipulations. When Margaret finally left Mama Lavinia's house, she carried with her a bag filled with protective charms, detailed instructions for spiritual cleansing rituals, and a much clearer understanding of the danger her students were facing. The elderly woman had also given her a hand-drawn map showing the location of Constance Whitmore's grave in Bonaventure Cemetery, explaining that visiting the burial site might be necessary if the protective measures proved insufficient. Sometimes talking directly to the spirit can help, Mama Lavinia had explained. Constance was a reasonable woman in life, a dedicated teacher who truly loved her students. If you can reach the part of her that remembers compassion and professional responsibility, you might be able to convince her to leave your children alone. Margaret returned to her small house as the sun was setting, the bag of protective charms feeling both reassuring and surreal in her hands. She had entered this day as a rational educator dealing with an unusual photographic anomaly, and she was ending it as someone actively engaged in supernatural combat for the souls of her students. The transformation felt jarring, but the evidence was undeniable, and the children's safety took precedence over her personal comfort with the situation. That evening, Margaret began the process of distributing protective charms to her students' families. She visited each EBO household personally, explaining that the children had been experiencing nightmares related to disturbing images and that these traditional remedies might help them sleep more peacefully. Most parents accepted the charms gratefully, asking no difficult questions about their origin or purpose. The Chen family received their protective items with particular reverence, Mrs. Chen immediately recognizing the spiritual significance of the herbs and Dashan symbols involved. Miss Ellis, these are powerful protections. The woman who made them understands the old ways of keeping evil spirits away from children. You have chosen your help well. Margaret's next stop was the Kowalski household, where James's father examined the protective charm with the serious attention of someone who had grown up with similar traditions. In Poland, we know about spirits who prey on children's sadness, he said as he accepted the small cloth bag. My grandmother taught me prayers for keeping such things away. I will teach them to James tonight. Each family visit reinforced Margaret's understanding that she was not dealing with this situation alone. Many of her students' families came from cultures that acknowledged supernatural threats and had developed their own methods for protection. The parents might not understand the specific details of what was happening, but they recognized the signs of spiritual danger and were prepared to take appropriate action. Timothy Walsh's mother, Sarah, was particularly helpful in Margaret's efforts. As a seamstress, she had keen observational skills and had already noticed changes in her son's behavior that suggested supernatural influence. "Miss Ellis, Timothy has been talking in his sleep for the past 3 nights, having conversations with someone who isn't there. He keeps saying that he wants to go home, but when I ask him what he means, he can't explain it." Margaret gave Sarah one of the stronger protective charms that Mama Lavinia had prepared, along with specific instructions for burning protective herbs in Timothy's bedroom. "Mrs. Walsh, it's important that Timothy understands he should not listen to any woman who visits his dreams, no matter what she promises him. The person he's talking to in his sleep is not someone who wants to help him." As Margaret continued her rounds, she began to notice patterns in how Constance was targeting different children. The spirit seemed to be focusing her attention on students who had experienced some form of loss or separation, using their emotional vulnerabilities as entry points for her manipulations. Children from immigrant families were particularly susceptible, as their natural questions about cultural identity and belonging provided opportunities for Constance to present herself as someone who could provide answers. Margaret's final stop of the evening was the boarding house where Robert Fitzgerald lived with his widowed mother. Robert had been one of the tallest students in the back row of the graduation photograph, standing directly next to where Constance appeared in the mysterious images. His mother, a practical woman who worked as a housekeeper for one of Savannah's wealthy families, listened carefully to Margaret's explanation about the protective charm. "Miss Ellis, Robert has been having the strangest dreams," Mrs. Fitzgerald said as she accepted the small cloth bag. "He dreams about a woman who claims to be his teacher from another school. One where all the children who have died go to continue their education. She tells him that he's been invited to join this special school, but that he has to come alone and can't tell anyone where he's going." Margaret felt a chill of recognition as she heard Mrs. Fitzgerald's description. Constance was adapting her approach to each child's interests and personality, presenting herself to Robert as an educator, offering advanced opportunities rather than simply exploiting his emotional vulnerabilities. The spirit's ability to customize her manipulations suggested a level of intelligence and planning that made her even more dangerous than Margaret had initially realized. "Mrs. Fitzgerald, it's crucial that Robert understands he should never agree to go anywhere with this woman. No matter how appealing her offers might sound, she's not a real teacher, and the school she describes doesn't exist in any form that would be safe for a living child." Margaret left the boarding house with a growing sense of urgency about the situation. Constance Whitmore's appearances in the children's dreams were becoming more frequent and more sophisticated, suggesting that the spirit was building towards some kind of decisive action. The protective charms might slow her progress, but Margaret suspected they wouldn't be sufficient to stop her completely. That night, Margaret barely slept, her mind racing with concerns about her students' safety and questions about her own ability to protect them. She kept the graduation photographs locked in a wooden box with protective herbs scattered around them, hoping to limit Constance's ability to use the images as supernatural doorways. But even with these precautions, Margaret could feel an oppressive presence in her house, as if something were watching her from the shadows. Around 3 a.m, Margaret was awakened by the sound of children's voices singing in her garden. She crept to her bedroom window and peered through the curtains, seeing nothing in the moonlit yard below. But the voices continued, young voices singing what sounded like a classroom song about arithmetic tables, their harmonies floating through the night air with an otherworldly quality that made Margaret's skin crawl. Margaret realized that Constance was escalating her activities, no longer content to work only through dreams and photographs. The spirit was beginning to manifest more directly in the physical world, and the children's voices suggested that she might already have established contact with some of Margaret's students in ways that went beyond simple dream manipulation. The next morning brought confirmation of Margaret's fears. 3 of her students failed to arrive at their homes the previous evening, and their parents had spent the night searching the streets of Savannah for any trace of the missing children. Rebecca Chen, Timothy Walsh, and Robert Fitzgerald had all disappeared between dinner time and bedtime, leaving no notes or explanations for their absence. Margaret joined the search efforts, her heart heavy with the knowledge that conventional methods were unlikely to locate the missing children. If Constance had indeed taken them, they might not be in any physical location that could be found through ordinary means. The spirit might have drawn them into some supernatural space, where the boundaries between life and death were less clearly defined. As the search continued through the morning without success, Margaret made the decision to visit Bonaventure Cemetery and attempt to communicate directly with Constance Whitmore's spirit. Mama Lavinia had warned her that such an encounter could be dangerous, but with 3 children missing and time running out, Margaret felt she had no choice but to confront the ghostly teacher directly. Bonaventure Cemetery was a sprawling expanse of moss-draped oaks and elaborate Victorian monuments, a place where Savannah's dead rested among sculptures and inscriptions that spoke of love, loss, and the hope of us. Eventual reunion. Margaret found Constance Whitmore's grave in a quiet section reserved for those who had died during the yellow fever outbreaks, a simple headstone that bore only her name and the dates of her birth and death. Margaret approached the gravesite with a mixture of determination and terror, unsure of what to expect, but committed to doing whatever was necessary to rescue her students. She placed one of the graduation photographs on Constance's headstone and spoke aloud, hoping that the spirit would hear her words and respond to her plea. "Constance, I know you can hear me. I know you've taken Rebecca, Timothy, and Robert, and I understand why you believe you need them. You lost your own students to yellow fever, and the grief has been eating at you for 25 years. But these children aren't yours to take. They have families who love them and futures that belong to them." End quote. For several minutes, nothing happened. Margaret stood in the cemetery's silence, listening to the sound of wind through the oak trees and wondering if her attempt at communication had failed. But gradually, the air around Constance's grave began to grow colder, and Margaret could see her breath forming small clouds despite the warm June morning. The temperature continued to drop until Margaret was shivering in her summer dress, and then she heard a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was a woman's voice, cultured and educated, but carrying an undertone of desperate sadness that made Margaret's heart ache with sympathy. "You don't understand what it's like to watch them die, one by one, while you stand helpless beside their beds. You don't know what it means to promise children that you'll always keep them safe, and then fail them when they need you most. Ah." The voice carried the weight of decades of grief and guilt, emotions so intense that they had transcended death itself. Margaret forced herself to remain calm, despite the supernatural cold and the overwhelming sadness that seemed to emanate from the gravesite. "Constance, I do understand loss, and I know you loved your students deeply, but taking living children won't bring back the ones you lost. It will only create new grief for other families." The voice grew stronger, more present, as if Constance were drawing energy from Margaret's emotional response. "They're better with me than in this world of disease and disappointment. I can give them an education that will never end, protect them from all the dangers that wait in the future. They'll never have to grow up and face the cruelties that adults inflict on each other." Margaret realized that Constance's grief had twisted her love for children into something possessive and ultimately destructive. The spirit genuinely believed that she was rescuing Margaret's students from future suffering, just as she wished someone could have rescued her own pupils from the yellow fever outbreak. But her good intentions didn't make her actions any less dangerous to the living children she had taken. "Constance, children need to grow up and face the world, even with all its dangers and disappointments. That's how they become the people they're meant to be. By keeping them with you, you're stealing their chances to live full lives, to make their own choices, to experience joy as well as sorrow." The cold around the gravesite intensified, and Margaret could feel Constance's presence growing stronger and more agitated. "Joy?" The spirit's voice carried a bitter laugh. "What joy is there in watching everyone you love die? What choice matters when death comes anyway, regardless of what you decide?" Margaret understood that she was confronting not just a supernatural threat, but a deeply traumatized soul whose pain had become so overwhelming that it clouded her judgment about right and wrong. Constance wasn't evil in any traditional sense. She was a grieving teacher whose love for her students had become distorted by loss and isolation. "Constance, your students who died in the yellow fever outbreak, they wouldn't want you to take other children from their families. They loved you too, and they would want you to find peace, not spend eternity trying to replace them with stolen souls." For a moment, the cold around the grave seemed to lessen, and Margaret thought she might be reaching the rational part of Constance's spirit. But then the temperature plummeted again, and the voice returned with renewed intensity. "You know nothing about what my students would want. They were taken from me before I could finish teaching them everything they needed to know. I failed them once. But I won't fail these new children. They'll stay with me where it's safe, where no disease can touch them, where no one can hurt them ever again." Margaret realized that rational argument alone wouldn't be sufficient to convince Constance to release the missing children. The spirit's grief and guilt had created a psychological prison that prevented her from seeing the harm she was causing. Margaret would need to find a different approach, one that addressed Constance's emotional needs while still securing the children's freedom. "Constance, what if there was another way for you to help children without taking them from their families? What if you could find peace by using your teaching skills to protect other children from the kind of tragedy that took your students?" The voice fell silent for several minutes, and Margaret could feel Constance considering this suggestion. When the spirit spoke again, her tone was less agitated, but still deeply skeptical. "What do you mean? How could I help children from beyond the grave without bringing them to safety with me?" Margaret took a deep breath, knowing that her next words might determine whether the missing children lived or died. "You could become a guardian spirit instead of a kidnapper. You could watch over children who are in danger and warn their teachers and parents when threats approach. You could use your knowledge of tragedy to prevent it from happening to others." The cold around the grave began to fluctuate, as if Constance were struggling with conflicting emotions and impulses. Margaret could sense the spirit's desperate desire to help children warring with her need to possess and control them. "But if I let them go, if I stop trying to keep them safe, what guarantee do I have that they won't suffer the same fate as my own students? What promise can you make that they'll live full, happy lives without ever knowing the kind of loss that destroyed me?" Margaret felt the weight of this impossible question. She couldn't promise that Rebecca, Timothy, and Robert would never experience loss or suffering. That was part of the human condition that no one could escape. But she could offer something else, something that might speak to Constance's identity as an educator. "I can't promise they'll never suffer, Constance, but I can promise that they'll have the chance to learn from whatever experiences life brings them. Isn't that what teaching is really about? Giving children the tools they need to handle whatever they encounter, not shielding them from all possible harm?" This argument seemed to resonate with something deep in Constance's spirit, perhaps touching the part of her that remembered what it meant to be a dedicated educator, rather than a grief-stricken kidnapper. The cold around the grave began to dissipate, and Margaret could feel the supernatural presence growing less oppressive. "They were so young," Constance's voice whispered, now carrying more sadness than anger. "My students, they had barely begun to learn about the world when the fever took them. I wanted so desperately to give them more time, more knowledge, more preparation for life." Margaret moved closer to the headstone, speaking directly to the grave as if Constance were physically present. "You did give them everything you could during the time you had together. The love and knowledge you shared with them mattered, even if their lives were shorter than anyone wanted. But stealing other children's futures won't honor their memory or heal your grief." The presence around the grave seemed to be wavering, as if Constance were fighting an internal battle between her protective instincts and her rational understanding of right and wrong. Margaret could sense that this was a crucial moment, the point at which the spirit would either release the children or commit fully to keeping them in whatever supernatural realm she had created. "Constance, I'm asking you, teacher to teacher, to let Rebecca, Timothy, and Robert return to their families. Help me continue the work you started, helping children learn and grow and become the people they're meant to be. Don't let your grief turn you into the kind of person who causes other families the same pain you've endured." The cold air around the cemetery began to warm, and Margaret could feel Constance's presence starting to fade. When the spirit spoke again, her voice was so faint that Margaret had to strain to hear it. "The children, they're in the old schoolhouse where I used to teach, the building that was torn down 10 years ago, but still stands in the place between places. They're safe there. But they're not truly alive either. You'll need to guide them back to the world of the living before they forget that they ever belonged there." Margaret felt a surge of relief that the children were still alive, but also concern about what Constance meant by, The place between places. How do I find this schoolhouse? How do I bring them back? Constance's voice was barely audible now, as if she were speaking from a great distance. Follow the path that leads backward from where the schoolhouse used to stand. Look for the building that exists only in memory and love. But hurry, teacher. The longer they stay in that place, the harder it becomes for them to remember why they should want to leave. The supernatural presence around the grave faded completely, leaving Margaret alone among the cemetery's moss-draped monuments. She remained there for several minutes, processing what had just occurred, and trying to understand the instructions Constance had given her. The old schoolhouse could only refer to the original Whitmore Elementary building, which had been demolished in 1900 when the current structure was built on a different site. Margaret left Bonaventure Cemetery with a sense of urgency driving her forward. She needed to find the location where the original Whitmore Elementary had stood and somehow access a supernatural version of the building that existed in the place between places. The task seemed impossible, but 3 children's lives depended on her success, and she was determined to bring them home safely. Margaret's first stop was the Savannah Historical Society, where she hoped to find records showing the exact location of the original Whitmore Elementary building. The Society's archives contained detailed maps of the city's development over the past century, including documentation of buildings that had been demolished to make way for newer construction. The Historical Society's librarian, Mr. Cornelius Ashworth, was intrigued by Margaret's request for information about the original school building. "Miss Ellis, may I ask why you're interested in that particular structure? The building was torn down quite some time ago, and there's nothing remarkable left at the site." Margaret chose her words carefully, not wanting to reveal the supernatural aspects of her search while still conveying the urgency of the situation. "Mr. Ashworth, I'm researching the history of education in Savannah for a special project, and I believe the original Whitmore Elementary might be significant to my work. Could you show me exactly where it was located?" Mr. Ashworth led Margaret to a large map of Savannah that showed the city's layout as it existed in 1885, the year of the yellow fever outbreak that had claimed Constance's students. The original Whitmore Elementary had stood on a plot of land that was now occupied by a small park, surrounded by newer residential buildings that had been constructed in the 1890s. The school was a 2-story brick building with a bell tower, Mr. Ashworth explained, pointing to architectural drawings that showed the structure's layout. It housed about 60 students and was considered quite modern for its time. The decision to demolish it was purely practical. The city needed a larger school building, and this site wasn't suitable for expansion. Margaret studied the architectural drawings carefully, memorizing the school's layout and trying to understand how a supernatural version of the building might manifest in the same location. According to Constance's instructions, she needed to look for the building that exists only in memory and love, which suggested that her emotional connection to the children and her understanding of educational purpose might be key to accessing the supernatural realm. Margaret thanked Mr. Ashworth for his assistance and made her way to the small park that now occupied the site of the original Whitmore Elementary. The area was quiet in the late afternoon, with only a few elderly residents sitting on benches and watching children play on the modern playground equipment. Margaret found it difficult to imagine that this peaceful space had once been the site of such tragedy and supernatural activity. Standing where the front entrance of the school would have been, Margaret closed her eyes and tried to visualize the building as it had appeared in the architectural drawings. She thought about Constance Whitmore standing in front of her classroom, teaching arithmetic and penmanship to children who trusted her to guide their education. She imagined the hallways filled with young voices and the sound of chalk scratching against blackboards as students worked through their lessons. For several minutes, nothing happened. Margaret began to worry that she had misunderstood Constance's instructions, or that the supernatural schoolhouse was beyond her ability to access. But gradually, she became aware of subtle changes in her surroundings that suggested something extraordinary was beginning to occur. The modern playground equipment seemed to fade around the edges, becoming less solid and present, while the air itself took on a different quality that reminded Margaret of old buildings filled with decades of accumulated memories. She could smell chalk dust and lamp oil, scents that had no logical source in the contemporary park setting, but that spoke to her mind of 19th-century classrooms and educational dedication. When Margaret opened her eyes, She found herself standing in front of a two-story brick building that matched the architectural drawings she had studied at the Historical Society. The structure appeared solid and real, but it existed in a strange twilight realm, where the normal rules of time and space seemed suspended. Modern Savannah was still visible around the edges of her vision, but the supernatural schoolhouse commanded her primary attention. Margaret approached the building's front entrance, noting details that confirmed she had successfully accessed the realm where Constance had taken the missing children. The brass nameplate beside the door read, "Whitmore Elementary School, established 1878, and through the windows she could see the warm glow of oil lamps illuminating empty classrooms that waited for students who would never return. The front door opened at her touch, and Margaret stepped into a hallway that felt both familiar and deeply unsettling. The walls were lined with children's artwork and educational posters, but everything had the slightly faded quality of memories that had been preserved beyond their natural lifespan. She could hear voices coming from one of the upstairs classrooms, young voices reciting lessons in the careful cadence of 19th-century education. Margaret climbed the stairs slowly, her footsteps echoing in the supernatural quiet of the building. The voices grew clearer as she approached what had been Constance's classroom, and she could distinguish Rebecca's voice among them, mechanically reciting multiplication tables with Timothy and Robert. But there was something wrong with their speech patterns, a hollow quality that suggested they were participating in these educational exercises without real understanding or engagement. Margaret reached the classroom door and peered inside, her heart breaking at what she saw. Rebecca, Timothy, and Robert sat at old-fashioned wooden desks, their modern clothing looking out of place in the 19th century setting. But it was their faces that truly alarmed Margaret. The children's expressions were vacant and dreamy, as if they were only partially present in their own bodies. Standing at the front of the classroom was Constance Whitmore, appearing much as she had in the graduation photograph, but more solid and present in this supernatural realm. The ghostly teacher was conducting an arithmetic lesson with the mechanical precision of someone who had repeated the same educational routines for decades. But her students' responses were equally mechanical, lacking the natural curiosity and engagement that characterized living children. Margaret entered the classroom quietly, not wanting to startle the children or provoke a confrontation with Constance that might endanger their chances of escape. The ghostly teacher noticed her presence immediately, pausing in her lesson to regard Margaret with a mixture of recognition and defensive hostility. "Miss Ellis, you shouldn't have come here. This is my classroom, and these are my students now. They're learning properly, safely, without any of the distractions and dangers that plague education in your world." Constance's voice carried the authority of someone who had maintained classroom discipline for decades, but underneath lay a desperate need to justify her actions. Margaret looked at the three children, noting their vacant expressions and the way they seemed to be fading around the edges, as if their connection to the world of the living was growing progressively weaker. "Constance, they're not really learning. They're just going through the motions without understanding or growth. This isn't education, it's imprisonment disguised as instruction." Rebecca, Timothy, and Robert continued their mechanical recitation of multiplication tables, apparently unaware of the conversation taking place around them. Margaret realized that the children were trapped in a kind of supernatural trance that prevented them from recognizing their situation or making autonomous decisions about their fate. "Children, can you hear me? Rebecca, Timothy, Robert, I'm Miss Ellis, your teacher from Whitmore Elementary. Your families are looking for you, and they want you to come home." Margaret spoke directly to her former students, hoping to break through whatever spell Constance had cast over them. For a moment, Rebecca's recitation faltered, and she looked up at Margaret with a flicker of recognition in her eyes. "Miss Ellis, I was supposed to help my mother with the laundry this afternoon. Why am I still in school?" Her voice carried genuine confusion, as if she were awakening from a deep sleep and trying to remember where she was supposed to be. Constance moved quickly to reassert control over the situation, placing her hand on Rebecca's shoulder and speaking in soothing tones that carried supernatural compulsion. "Don't worry about such mundane concerns, dear. Your real education is happening here, where you can learn everything you need to know without interruption or limitation." Margaret realized that she was engaged in a battle for the children's souls, a contest between Constance's supernatural influence and the children's natural desire to return to their families and normal lives. The ghostly teacher's power in this realm was considerable, but it was based on the children's gradual acceptance of their situation rather than direct force. Rebecca, think about your parents. They love you and need you to come home. Think about your real life, not this artificial classroom where nothing you learn will ever help you grow into the person you're meant to become. Margaret spoke with all the authority and affection she had developed during her years as an educator, trying to re-establish her connection with her former students. Timothy looked up from his arithmetic, his eyes showing more awareness than his classmates. Miss Ellis, the lady said our families don't really need us anymore, that we're better off learning here where nothing bad can happen to us. But I miss my mother, and I want to go home for supper. Constance's expression grew more desperate as she sensed her control over the children beginning to weaken. Timothy, you don't understand the dangers that wait for you in the outside world. Here, you'll never have to worry about disappointment or loss or any of the cruel realities that destroy children's innocence. Margaret stepped closer to Timothy's desk, maintaining eye contact with the boy while addressing Constance's concerns. Constance, protecting children from all disappointment and loss isn't education, it's stagnation. Children need to experience challenges and setbacks as part of their growth. Your job as a teacher was never to shield them from life, but to prepare them for it. Robert, who had been the most deeply entranced of the three children, suddenly looked up with tears in his eyes. I want to see my mother. She must be worried about me, and I promised to help her with the evening chores. Why can't I remember how I got to this classroom? The supernatural classroom began to flicker and fade around the edges as the children's awareness of their true situation increased. Margaret realized that Constance's power over them was directly connected to their acceptance of the ghostly teacher's version of reality. As they remembered their real lives and relationships, the supernatural realm became less stable and compelling. Constance made one final attempt to maintain control over her stolen students, moving to the center of the classroom and speaking with all the authority she could muster. Children, you must trust me. I've been teaching for decades, and I know what's best for your education and safety. Miss Ellis doesn't understand the special opportunities available to you here. But the children were no longer listening to Constance's promises and reassurances. They had remembered their families, their real lives, and their desire to return to the world where they belonged. Rebecca stood up from her desk, followed by Timothy and Robert, and they moved toward Margaret as if she represented a doorway back to everything they had temporarily forgotten. Margaret gathered the three children around her, feeling their warmth and solidity returning as they reconnected with their living identities. It's time to go home now. Your families are waiting for you, and they've been very worried since you disappeared. The supernatural classroom continued to fade and flicker, its walls becoming transparent as Constance's power over the realm weakened. The ghostly teacher stood alone at the front of her empty classroom, her expression shifting between anger, sadness, and a growing recognition that her attempt to rebuild her lost family had failed. You're taking them back to a world that will hurt them, Constance said, her voice carrying decades of accumulated grief and fear. I could have kept them safe forever, given them an education that never ended, protected them from all the cruelties that await them in life. Margaret felt genuine sympathy for the ghostly teacher's pain, but she also understood that Constance's solution was fundamentally wrong. Safety isn't the highest goal of education, Constance. Growth is. These children need to experience life fully, with all its joys and sorrows, in order to become the people they're meant to be. As Margaret led Rebecca, Timothy, and Robert toward the classroom door, the supernatural schoolhouse began to dissolve around them. The 19th century desks and educational materials faded like morning mist, replaced by the familiar sights and sounds of contemporary Savannah. They found themselves standing in the small park where the original Whitmore Elementary had once stood. With the modern playground equipment solid and present around them, the three children looked around in confusion, trying to understand how they had gone from sitting in a classroom to standing in an outdoor park with no memory of the transition. Margaret realized that their experience in Constance's supernatural realm would seem like a strange dream to them, a confused memory that would fade with time rather than traumatize them with impossible recollections. Miss Ellis, how did we get to the park? Rebecca asked, her voice carrying the natural confusion of someone awakening from a vivid dream. I remember being in a classroom, but it wasn't our classroom, and there was a different teacher there. Margaret knelt down to the children's eye level, choosing her words carefully to provide comfort without adding to their confusion. You were having a shared dream experience that sometimes happens to children who have been through stressful situations. The important thing is that you're safe now, and your families are looking for you. We need to get you home as quickly as possible. Margaret walked the 3 children through Savannah's evening streets, delivering each one safely to their worried families. The reunion scenes were emotional and heartwarming, with parents who had feared the worst, embracing children who seemed confused but unharmed by their supernatural experience. Margaret provided simple explanations about the children wandering off and becoming disoriented, avoiding any mention of ghostly teachers or supernatural classrooms. The Chen family received Rebecca with overwhelming relief, Mrs. Chen examining her daughter carefully for any signs of harm or distress. When she was satisfied that Rebecca was physically uninjured, Mrs. Chen thanked Margaret with deep bows and insisted that she stay for tea while Rebecca told her version of what had happened. I remember being very sleepy, and then I was in a classroom with Timothy and Robert. But it wasn't our real classroom, Rebecca explained as she sipped her tea. There was a lady teacher there who seemed very sad, and she wanted us to learn arithmetic that never ended. But I kept thinking about you and Papa, and I wanted to come home for supper. Margaret left the Chen family's laundry with assurance that Rebecca was suffering no lasting effects from her supernatural experience. The child seemed to be processing the events as an unusual, but ultimately, harmless adventure. Exactly the kind of response that would allow her to integrate the experience without trauma. Timothy Walsh's reunion with his mother was equally emotional, with Sarah Walsh holding her son close, while he tried to explain his confused memories of the afternoon. Margaret provided Sarah with one of Mama Lavinia's stronger protective charms, explaining that Timothy might benefit from additional spiritual protection as he processed his unusual experience. Miss Ellis, Timothy keeps talking about a teacher who wanted to keep him safe from growing up, Sarah said as she prepared a late supper for her son. He says she seemed very lonely and wanted him to stay with her forever, but that he knew he belonged with his real family. Margaret nodded, understanding that Timothy's natural attachment to his mother had been strong enough to help him resist Constance's supernatural influence. Mrs. Walsh, children have an instinctive knowledge of where they belong. Timothy's love for you and his desire to come home were powerful protections against anyone who might try to lead him astray. Robert Fitzgerald's return to his mother was perhaps the most poignant of the 3 reunions. Mrs. Fitzgerald had spent the entire day searching the streets of Savannah, fearing that her son might have fallen into the river or been injured in some accident that would leave her completely alone in the world. When Margaret appeared at her boarding house with Robert in tow, Mrs. Fitzgerald broke down in tears of relief and gratitude. Miss Ellis, I don't know how to thank you for bringing him home safely, Mrs. Fitzgerald said as she held Robert close. He's all I have left in this world, and the thought of losing him was more than I could bear. What happened to him? Where has he been all day? Margaret provided Mrs. Fitzgerald with the same gentle explanation she had given the other families, emphasizing that Robert had become confused and disoriented, but was now safe and unharmed. She also gave Mrs. Fitzgerald one of Mama Lavinia's protective charms, explaining that it would help Robert sleep peacefully and avoid any recurring nightmares related to his experience. Robert himself seemed the most affected by his time in Constance's supernatural classroom. His usually cheerful demeanor replaced by a thoughtful seriousness that suggested he was processing complex emotions. Mother, I dreamed about a teacher who said she could teach me everything in the world, but when I tried to learn from her, nothing she taught me felt real or important. I kept thinking about you and wanting to come home to help with our evening chores. As Margaret made her way home through Savannah's quiet evening streets, she reflected on the day's extraordinary events and their resolution. 3 children had been rescued from supernatural captivity, a grieving spirit had been confronted with the truth about her actions, and a community had been protected from a threat that few people would ever fully understand. But Margaret also understood that the experience had changed her in fundamental ways that would affect her approach to teaching and her understanding of the responsibilities that came with caring for young minds. The next morning brought a sense of normalcy that felt almost surreal after the supernatural drama of the previous day. Margaret returned to her empty classroom at Whitmore Elementary, preparing for the summer break and the administrative tasks that would occupy her time until the next school year began. But the graduation photographs remained locked in their wooden box, surrounded by protective herbs, and serving as a reminder of how quickly ordinary educational situations could become extraordinary. Challenges. Margaret spent the morning writing detailed reports about each of her former students' progress and potential, documents that would help their future teachers understand their individual strengths and needs. As she worked, she found herself thinking about Constance Whitmore and wondering whether the ghostly teacher had finally found the peace that had eluded her for 25 years. Around midday, Margaret was surprised by a visit from Mama Lavinia, who arrived at the school carrying a small bundle wrapped in black cloth. The elderly woman's expression was serious, but not alarmed, suggesting that she brought news rather than warnings about new supernatural threats. "Miss Ellis, I felt Constance's spirit departing early this morning," Mama Lavinia said as she settled into one of the child-sized chairs in Margaret's classroom. "She's moved on to whatever realm awaits teachers who have completed their earthly responsibilities. The crisis is over, but there are things you need to understand about what happened and why." Mama Lavinia unwrapped her bundle to reveal the original graduation photograph from Margaret's session, but this version showed no trace of Constance's mysterious presence. The image depicted exactly what had been physically present during the photography session. 22 children and their beloved teacher captured in a moment of educational celebration. "This is how the photograph always should have appeared," Mama Lavinia explained. Constance's spiritual energy was distorting the images, using them as windows into the world of the living. Now that she's found peace, the photographs show only what was actually there when they were taken. Margaret examined the corrected photograph carefully, noting how natural and normal it appeared compared to the disturbing images she had been dealing with for weeks. "Mama Lavinia, what convinced Constance to release the children and move on? I spoke with her at the cemetery, but I wasn't sure my arguments had been effective." The elderly woman smiled, her expression carrying the wisdom of someone who had dealt with supernatural situations for decades. "Miss Ellis, Constance wasn't convinced by logical arguments about right and wrong. She was convinced by seeing genuine love and dedication in action. When you risked entering her supernatural realm to rescue those children, you proved that you understood the same deep commitment to education that had motivated her own actions." End quote. Mama Lavinia explained that Constance's spiritual transformation had occurred when she witnessed Margaret's willingness to confront supernatural dangers for the sake of her students' welfare. The ghostly teacher had recognized in Margaret the same passionate dedication to children's welfare that had defined her own career, and this recognition had helped her understand the difference between protective love and possessive control. "Constance saw herself in you, but she also saw what she could have become if her grief hadn't distorted her judgment. Your courage and commitment reminded her of why she had become a teacher in the first place: to help children grow and learn, not to keep them trapped in artificial safety." Margaret felt a deep sense of closure as she understood the spiritual dynamics that had resolved the crisis. Her confrontation with Constance hadn't been just about rescuing 3 specific children. It had been about helping a tormented spirit remember her true purpose and find the peace that comes from fulfilling one's deepest calling. Over the following days, Margaret distributed the corrected graduation photographs to her students' families, explaining that there had been a processing error with the original prints that had now been resolved. The families accepted the new photographs gratefully, noting how much clearer and more natural they appeared compared to the earlier versions. Mrs. Chen examined the corrected photograph carefully, comparing it to her memories of the graduation ceremony. "Miss Ellis, this picture feels right in a way the other one didn't. It captures the joy and accomplishment that we all felt that day, without any of the strange shadows that seemed to darken the earlier version." The Kowalski family expressed similar satisfaction with the corrected photograph, with James's father noting that his son seemed more relaxed and cheerful since receiving the new image. "Miss Ellis, James has been sleeping peacefully ever since you brought him this new photograph. Whatever was troubling him before seems to have been resolved." Margaret's final visit was to the Walsh boarding house, where she delivered the corrected photograph to Timothy and his mother. Sarah Walsh studied the image with her seamstress's eye for detail, nodding with approval at what she saw. "Miss Ellis, this photograph tells the true story of that graduation day, Sarah said, as she showed the image to Timothy. It shows children who are proud of their achievements and ready to face whatever comes next in their education. That's the kind of memory worth preserving. Timothy examined the photograph with the serious attention he gave to all educational materials, his young face showing relief as he confirmed that the disturbing presence was no longer visible among his classmates. "Miss Ellis, this picture feels happy in a way the other one didn't. I can look at it without feeling sad or worried about anything." As Margaret completed her distribution of the corrected photographs, she reflected on the lessons the entire experience had taught her about the nature of education and the responsibilities that came with caring care for young minds. The supernatural crisis had forced her to confront questions about protection versus growth, safety versus challenge, and the fine line between nurturing love and possessive control. Margaret returned to her classroom for the final time before summer break, packing away the supplies and materials that would await her return in the fall. As she worked, she found herself thinking about the new school year and the fresh group of students who would soon occupy these desks and fill these walls with the energy of learning and discovery. The experience with Constance Whitmore had deepened Margaret's understanding of what it meant to be an educator in ways that no teacher training could have provided. She had learned that true educational love meant preparing children for independence rather than fostering dependence, encouraging growth rather than preventing change, and accepting that the ultimate goal of teaching was to help students move beyond their need for any particular teacher. Margaret locked her classroom door for the summer, carrying with her a sense of completion that went beyond the normal satisfaction of finishing a successful school year. She had faced an extraordinary challenge and emerged with a deeper appreciation for both the privileges and responsibilities of her chosen profession. As she walked through Savannah's sun-dappled streets toward her small house, Margaret reflected on the mysterious nature of the experience she had just concluded. Most people would never believe the supernatural aspects of what had occurred, and perhaps that was for the best. The important thing was that 3 children had been safely returned to their families, a tormented spirit had found peace, and a community had been protected from a threat that transcended ordinary understanding. That evening, Margaret sat in her garden with a cup of tea, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of rose and gold. The graduation photographs were stored safely in her house, no longer carrying any supernatural threat, but serving as reminders of the extraordinary events that had unfolded around what should have been a simple school milestone. Margaret found herself thinking about Constance Whitmore and wondering what kind of teacher she had been before grief and loss had distorted her perspective. Based on the dedication she had shown even in her ghostly state, Constance had probably been much like Margaret herself, a woman who had devoted her life to nurturing young minds and helping children reach their full potential. The tragedy of Constance's story wasn't just that she had lost her students to yellow fever, but that her grief had prevented her from understanding that their deaths didn't diminish the value of the education and love she had provided them during their brief lives. Every teacher faced the reality that their students would eventually move beyond their influence, and the measure of educational success wasn't how long teachers could maintain control over their students, but how well they prepared those students for independent lives. Margaret made a silent promise to remember Constance's story whenever she felt tempted to become too possessive of her own students' affections or too protective of them from life's natural challenges. The ghostly teacher's fate served as a powerful reminder that educational love must always be directed toward the student's growth and independence, rather than the teacher's need for connection and control. As the stars appeared in Savannah's evening sky, Margaret felt a sense of peace settling over her thoughts. The supernatural crisis was truly over, but its lessons would continue to inform her teaching for years to come. She had learned things about courage, dedication, and the true nature of educational responsibility that would make her a better teacher and a more complete person. Margaret spent the rest of the summer preparing for the new school year with renewed enthusiasm and deeper wisdom. She read educational journals and attended professional development sessions, but she also took time to reflect on the spiritual dimensions of teaching that were rarely discussed in academic settings. The experience with Constance had taught her that education was more than just transmitting knowledge and skills. It was about nurturing souls and preparing young people for the full complexity of human existence. When September arrived and Margaret welcomed a new group of students into her classroom, She did so with a profound appreciation for the trust that parents placed in her care. Each child represented a unique combination of potential and vulnerability, and Margaret's job was to help them develop their strengths while building the resilience they would need to face life's inevitable challenges. Margaret never again experienced anything as dramatically supernatural as her encounter with Constance Whitmore, but she remained aware of the mysterious dimensions that surrounded all educational relationships. The bonds between teachers and students operated on levels that transcended ordinary professional interactions, creating connections that could persist long after formal education had ended. Years later, when Margaret had become one of Savannah's most respected educators, she would occasionally tell trusted colleagues about the importance of understanding the deeper responsibilities that came with teaching. She spoke about the need to balance protection with challenge, nurturing with independence, and love with professional boundaries. But she never mentioned the supernatural crisis that had taught her these lessons, understanding that some educational wisdom was best transmitted through example rather than explanation. Margaret's graduation photographs from that memorable class of 1910 hung in her parlor for the rest of her life, serving as reminders of both the joys and responsibilities of her chosen profession. Visitors would often comment on how happy and confident the children looked in the image, and Margaret would smile, knowing that the photograph captured exactly what it should, a moment of educational celebration unmarred by any supernatural shadows. The experience with Constance Whitmore had taught Margaret that teaching was ultimately about love, but love properly understood and appropriately expressed. It was about caring enough for students to prepare them for independence, loving them enough to allow them to face challenges and make mistakes, and trusting them enough to believe they could handle whatever life brought their way. Margaret's career continued for another 20 years, during which she taught hundreds of children and helped shape the next generation of Savannah's citizens. She never forgot the lessons learned during that supernatural summer, and her students benefited from the wisdom she had gained through her encounter with a grieving spirit who had loved too possessively and protected too completely. When Margaret finally retired from teaching, she left behind a legacy of students who had been prepared not just academically, but emotionally and spiritually for the complexities of adult life. Her approach to education, informed by her understanding of both its possibilities and its dangers, had created generations of young people who were confident in their abilities, but humble in their approach to learning. Margaret passed away peacefully in 1935, surrounded by former students who had become teachers themselves, carrying forward her educational philosophy to new generations of children. Her funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by her dedication and wisdom, and her grave in Bonaventure Cemetery became a place where teachers would come to reflect on their own calling and responsibilities. The graduation photograph from 1910 was donated to the Savannah Historical Society, where it became part of an exhibit about the evolution of public education in the city. Visitors to the exhibit would often comment on the joy and confidence visible in the children's faces. And museum guides would explain that the photograph represented the best traditions of American education, capturing a moment when students and teacher came together in celebration of learning and growth. But the photograph's most important legacy wasn't as a historical artifact, but as a reminder of the lessons learned during that extraordinary summer when the boundaries between the natural and supernatural worlds had briefly dissolved. Those lessons continue to inform educational practice in ways both subtle and profound, helping teachers understand that their work involved not just minds and bodies, but souls as well. The story of Constance Whitmore and Margaret Ellis became part of Savannah's unofficial folklore, passed down among educators as a cautionary tale about the importance of healthy boundaries in educational relationships. While the supernatural elements were often dismissed as embellishment, the core message remained powerful, that teaching required a special kind of love that prioritized students' growth over teachers' needs. Margaret's house eventually became a boarding house for young teachers new to Savannah, and many of them reported experiencing dreams about a kindly older woman who offered advice about handling difficult educational challenges. Whether these dreams represented Margaret's continued presence or simply the power of her example, they served to perpetuate the wisdom she had gained through her encounter with the supernatural. The original Whitmore Elementary building, constructed to replace the structure where Constance had taught, continued to serve Savannah's children for many decades. Teachers working there often reported feeling a special sense of responsibility and dedication, as if the building itself carried memories of educational devotion that inspired everyone who worked within its walls. In the end, the story of the teachers' class in 1910 became more than just an account of supernatural intervention and rescue. It became a testament to the transformative power of education when practiced with wisdom, courage, and genuine love for students' welfare. The photograph that had once contained a mysterious and threatening presence was transformed into a symbol of education's highest ideals, capturing a moment when learning and growth were celebrated without reservation or shadow. The lessons learned during that extraordinary summer continued to resonate through generations of teachers and students, reminding them that education was ultimately about preparing young people for lives of meaning, purpose, and contribution. The supernatural crisis had passed, but the wisdom gained from confronting it remained, helping educators understand that their work was both a professional calling and a sacred trust that demanded the very best of their hearts, minds, and souls.